In 2552, humanity was dying by degrees. Not quickly, not cleanly. The way things died when the thing killing them was patient and vast and operating on a timeline that made human strategic planning feel like children arranging stones against a tide. Colony by colony, system by system, the Covenant came and burned what humanity had spent generations building and moved on to the next target with the specific indifference of people who believed they were doing sacred work. The soldiers of the UNSC had learned over 27 years of this war what hope looked like in a conflict you were losing. It looked like buying time. It looked like making the cost high enough that the next target might be chosen instead of yours. Now it looked like a damaged frigate and 2 escort ships jumping blind through slipspace with Covenant pursuit signatures 12 minutes behind, and no destination in the navigation computer because the navigation computer had taken a plasma bolt to its primary array, and the only thing left was the emergency jump protocol that would take you somewhere, anywhere, as long as it was not here. It did not look like salvation. It never looked like salvation. But sometimes slipspace took you somewhere it had no business taking you, and sometimes somewhere turned out to be a blue-green world, surrounded by fragmented moon debris, with energy readings that matched nothing in the database, and creatures in the forests below that made Covenant look straightforward. Sometimes the wrong coordinates were the ones that changed everything. This is what happened when the Meridian's last stand ran out of right coordinates and found Remnant instead. The slipspace exit was wrong from the first millisecond. Lieutenant Commander Yara Chen felt it before Celeste reported it. The specific quality of a slipspace transition that had gone somewhere unintended. The slight temporal displacement that experienced spacers learned to recognize as the difference between a clean arrival and one that made you check your instruments twice before trusting them. 22 years in the UNSC Navy, 11 of them fighting the Covenant. She had made hundreds of slipspace jumps, and she knew what arriving in the right place felt like, and this was not it. "Celeste," she said. "Working," the AI responded. Her avatar, a small figure rendered in pale blue light, precise and economical in her movements, in the way that AIs sometimes were when they were processing at capacity and had reduced non-essential output to minimum, was already cycling through the navigation display faster than human eyes could follow. The bridge of the Meridian's last stand was quiet in the specific way that bridges got quiet when the crew was waiting for information they were fairly certain they didn't want. 16 officers at their stations, all of them watching Celeste's avatar, all of them aware of the same thing Chen was aware of. The navigation display was not showing known space, not Covenant-controlled space, not contested space, not the outer colony shipping lanes or the inner colony defense corridors or any of the 17 emergency jump coordinates that the UNSC's Strategic Planning Division had spent 3 years pre-calculating for exactly the category of situation the Meridian's last stand was currently in. Nothing. A star system that was not in the database. "Status on Kestrel and Bright Morning," Chen said. "Kestrel is with us," Lieutenant Vasquez reported from Tactical. "Bright Morning she's venting, aft section. Engineering reports they've contained the breach, but they've lost secondary propulsion and 2-point defense batteries." Chen absorbed this without letting it change her expression. bright morning had taken the plasma bolt that damaged their navigation array. The frigate had been fighting with everything she had since Reach's outer perimeter, and she was running out of everything. "Celeste, I have a preliminary fix," the AI said. The navigation display stabilized, pulling back to show their position relative to the nearest cataloged stellar landmarks. The scale adjustment took 4 seconds. When it finished, every officer on the bridge understood simultaneously why Celeste had taken 4 seconds to report. They were not in human space. They were not in any charted space. The nearest cataloged stellar body was 52 light-years away. 52 light-years from the outermost edge of any map any human had ever made, which meant they were, in any practical sense, nowhere except. "There's a planet," Celeste said. The main display shifted to show it. Blue-green, visually similar to Earth at first assessment, surrounded by what appeared to be the debris field of a moon that had fractured at some point in the geological past. The debris formed a partial ring rather than a complete one, giving the planet the appearance of a world that had been partially unwrapped. "Habitable?" Chen asked. "Atmosphere reads as breathable. Surface temperature within human tolerance. Liquid water confirmed across 63% of visible surface, but Captain..." Celeste paused in the specific way she paused when she was about to say something she had not yet found the right framing for. "The energy readings from the surface are not consistent with anything in my database." "Covenant technology?" "No." "Forerunner?" "No. I have run 17 classification attempts. The energy signature is crystalline in origin, buried in significant concentrations across multiple surface locations. It is not any technology I recognize." Another pause. "It is also extraordinarily powerful. If the readings are accurate and not a sensor artifact, we are looking at an energy density that would be relevant to human survival in ways I'm still calculating." Chen looked at the planet on the display, looked at the navigation console showing 52 light-years to the nearest anything they knew, looked at the tactical display showing bright morning venting slowly into space while her engineering team fought to keep her alive. "Covenant pursuit status," she said. "Their last tracked position put them 12 minutes behind our jump," Celeste said. "The slip space corridor we used was damaged. It may have closed behind us. It may not have." The AI's avatar was still for a moment. "I calculate a 93% probability that they followed our jump signature." 93. "Yes, Captain." "How long do we have if they followed?" "Unknown. Slip space transit time through a damaged corridor is unpredictable. Hours, possibly longer, possibly less." Celeste looked at her directly through the avatar display. "Possibly they arrived in a different location entirely. Damaged corridors have variable exit points. It is also possible the corridor closed completely and they cannot follow." "But you think 93%? "I think 93%, Celeste confirmed. Chen turned back to the planet. The energy readings were still scrolling across her secondary display. She was not a scientist, and she did not have the framework to assess what Celeste was seeing in the data. But she had been in the UNSC long enough to know what an asset looked like. An unknown energy source of significant density on a habitable planet in a system where the Covenant couldn't follow them was either an opportunity or a threat. And she had been in this war long enough to know that opportunities and threats were usually the same thing seen from different angles. "Go dark," she said. "Full emissions control. Drop us to low orbit on passive approach. I want a complete sensor sweep of the surface before we decide anything else." She looked at Tactical. "Get me a channel to Kestrel, and someone tell Bright Morning's captain that we are not leaving her behind, and I need an honest assessment of her repair timeline." "Captain," Celeste said. "Yes." "While I'm conducting the surface sweep, there's something you should know." The AI's avatar turned to face the main display. The atmospheric composition includes elevated concentrations of particulate matter consistent with large-scale biological activity, not industrial, biological. She paused. "There is something alive down there, many somethings." "Human?" "Unknown. The readings are consistent with human biology in some respects, not in others." Another pause longer than the previous ones. "I'll have more in 2 hours." Chen nodded. 2 hours. She looked at Bright Morning on the tactical display, leaking atmosphere into the dark of an uncharted system, and thought about 12 minutes and 93%, and an energy source that nobody in the UNSC had ever catalogued. She thought about the specific quality of a situation that had no good options and several options that were merely survivable. 2 hours, she said. "Everyone gets 2 hours to breathe. Then we make decisions." She stood from the command chair. "Mr. Vasquez, you have the bridge. Someone wake up Sergeant Major Okafor and tell him I need to speak with him about a possible ground operation." Vasquez looked at her. "We're going down there, Captain." Chen looked at the planet on the display, at the blue-green surface and the fragmented moon, and the energy readings that didn't match anything, and the biological activity that was consistent with human biology in some respects and not in others. "Not yet," she said. "But if the Covenant followed us here, I want to understand what we're standing on before we have to defend it." She walked to her ready room. Behind her, Celeste continued running scans. 3 hours and 40 minutes later, at 0217 ship time, the AI knocked on Chen's ready room door and said, through the intercom, with the careful, measured tone she used when the information she was delivering was going to be difficult to process, "Captain, you need to see what the drones found." Chen had not been sleeping. "Show me," she said. The ready room display activated. The footage ran for 90 seconds without either of them speaking. When it finished, Chen sat in the specific silence of someone who had spent 11 years fighting a war against the most terrifying enemy humanity had ever encountered, and had just discovered that terrifying was a category with room in it. "Celeste," she said. "Yes, Captain." "What are those things?" "Unknown," the AI said, "but they are attracted to the drone's heat signature in a way that suggests active predation rather than defensive behavior. And Captain..." Celeste paused. "They are also moving toward the coast facing our orbital position." "They can sense us from orbit?" "Not us," Celeste said carefully. "I believe they're responding to something the crew is projecting emotionally. The concentrations are highest in the areas directly below our current position and appear to be scaling with the number of personnel we have on deck." A pause. "Mo, I don't have a mechanism for this. I'm telling you the correlation because the correlation is consistent, and I think you need to know it." Chen looked at the footage still visible on her display. at the black shapes moving through the forest below, with the specific coordinated intelligence of something that had been doing this for a very long time. "These things respond to how scared we are," she said. "The data is consistent with that interpretation," Celeste said. Chen thought about a fleet full of traumatized soldiers who had spent 11 years watching their civilization burn. Thought about what scared looked like when it had been accumulating for 11 years. Thought about the creatures in the footage moving toward the coastline below their position. "Wake Sergeant Major Okafor," she said, "and the Spartan. Tell them we have a timeline." "Yes, Captain." "And Celeste." "Yes." "Add this to the report you're compiling. Everything. I want a complete picture before anyone else has to look at it." Chen stood. "Because if this system is about to have company, I want to understand what we're standing on before the Covenant gets here and makes understanding things considerably harder." "Understood," Celeste said. Outside the Ready Room viewport, Remnant turned slowly in the dark of an uncharted system, blue-green and ancient and entirely indifferent to the small metal ships that had arrived in its sky without warning or invitation. Below the surface, in concentrations that Celeste's instruments were still attempting to classify, dust pulsed with the specific energy of something that had been waiting in its crystalline patience for a very long time. In the forests south of Vale, the Grim began to move. Celeste ran her 17th classification attempt on the dust readings at 0340 ship time and arrived at the same result she had arrived at 16 times previously. Unknown. Not unknown in the way that New Covenant technology was unknown. Identifiable as artificial, as intentional, as the product of engineering that could be reverse engineered given sufficient data. Not unknown in the way that Forerunner artifacts were unknown. Ancient and strange, but operating on principles that human science could at least build a framework around. Unknown in the way that something was unknown when it existed outside every framework you had available, and the frameworks themselves were the problem rather than the data. She added a 17th entry to her classification log and began constructing an 18th approach. The AI worked in the specific way she always worked when a problem was genuinely resistant, not with frustration, which was a human response to uncertainty that she had observed extensively and understood conceptually, but with the quality of systematic attention that came from having more processing capacity than any single problem required, and choosing to direct all of it anyway. Celeste had been called thorough by Captain Chen on 14 separate occasions. She had been called excessive on 3. She considered both assessments accurate and saw no contradiction between them. The dust was not Forerunner. See, she was certain of this because she had the complete Forerunner energy signature database from UNSC research archives, and the dust signature shared 9% of its spectral characteristics with Forerunner technology and 91% with something that had no entry in any database she could access. 9% overlap in spectral characteristics was the kind of number that meant not the same thing, but possibly the same universe of physics, which was itself interesting but was not a classification. The dust was not naturally occurring in any standard geological sense. She was certain of this because naturally occurring crystalline energy sources, followed known thermodynamic patterns, and the dust's energy output violated 3 of them in ways that suggested the violations were features rather than anomalies. The dust was extraordinarily dense. She was certain of this because the instruments were functioning correctly. She had run 3 diagnostic cycles to verify, and the readings were real. What the dust was, in any positive definitional sense, remained the 17th open question on her active processing list. She flagged it and moved to the 18th. The Marine Common Room on Deck 4 had been quiet for an hour when Sergeant Major Darius Okafor entered and found what he expected to find: 12 men and women who had been told 2 hours ago that they were potentially going planetside, and had responded by doing what experienced soldiers did when they were given a timeline and no additional orders. They were watching the drone footage, not in the alert-focused way they watch tactical briefings. In the specific way people watched things that their training had not prepared them for, leaning forward slightly, occasionally exchanging looks with the person next to them, the low-register conversation of soldiers trying to build a threat assessment for something that their threat assessment architecture had no entry for. Okafor had watched the footage himself twice before coming down. He had spent 23 years in the UNSC Marine Corps. He had fought Covenant on 6 different worlds. He had been present at the fall of Reach in a forward fire base that had taken 3 plasma strikes in 4 hours and had walked away from all 3 because the UNSC had built its fire bases to take plasma strikes, and he had been in the right place at the right time, which was the only honest explanation for why he was still alive when a significant percentage of the people he had served alongside were not. He had seen things. The footage was in a different category from the things he had seen. "Sergeant Major," said Corporal Reyes, who was 22 years old and had been in the UNSC for 14 months, and whose threat assessment architecture was significantly less developed than Okafor's, and whose expression communicated that she was operating at the edge of what 14 months of training covered. "What are those things?" "Unknown," Okafor said, "which is what makes them interesting." "They're moving toward us," Reyes said. "The AI said they can sense us from orbit." "The AI said the data is consistent with that interpretation," Okafor corrected. He had read Celeste's briefing 3 times, and he was precise about what it said. "Which is different." "How is it different?" "Because one of those things means we know something. The other means we think we know something." He looked at the footage. "Until we know which one it is, we treat it as a hypothesis and we plan for the worst case." "What's the worst case?" Okafor thought about a planet full of creatures that responded to human fear, and a fleet full of people who had been accumulating reasons to be afraid for 11 years. "We keep the crew calm," he said. "That's the mission right now, not the ground operation, not the Covenant. We keep 3 ships worth of traumatized soldiers from generating enough emotional signal to bring everything on that planet down on our heads while we're trying to figure out what we're doing." He looked around the room. "Which means I need every person in this room to understand something." The room got quieter. "Fear is a reasonable response to the footage you just watched," Okafor said. "You're allowed to have it. What you're not allowed to do is let it run. Not here, not now. You manage it the same way you manage it in combat. You give it a task. You find something useful to do with the energy, and you do it until the feeling has somewhere to go, besides into the air around you. He paused, because apparently the air around us is a tactical resource right now, and I don't want to waste it. A beat of silence. Then Private Torres, who was 20 years old and had the specific quality of someone who processed difficulty through dry observation, said, "Sergeant Major, are you telling us our feelings are a weapons system?" "I'm telling you our feelings are currently a liability," Okafor said, "and I want you to convert them into something else." "Yes." Torres considered this. "That's the most UNSC thing I've ever heard." "Thank you," Okafor said. "Now somebody tell me the status of Recon Team Kilo, because we've got a timeline and I want them ready." Recon Team Kilo assembled in Bay 3 at 0500 ship time. 4 ODSTs, Okafor himself, Reyes, Torres, and Staff Sergeant Amara Diallo, who had been fighting Covenant infantry for 7 years and whose threat assessment architecture was precisely calibrated and extremely competent, and was currently running a continuous low-level background process on the drone footage that she was managing with the professional composure of someone who had decided that professional composure was the only available option. And one Spartan, Catherine B320, had been assigned to the Meridian's last stand 6 weeks ago during the chaos of Reach's final defensive operations, when the UNSC's command structure had been fragmenting fast enough that Spartan assignment protocols had simplified to put them where they're needed. Deal with the paperwork if there's a later. She was Spartan 3, Alpha Company. They're one of the survivors of a program that had not been designed to produce survivors, and had produced a small number anyway, through the specific combination of extraordinary capability and the kind of luck that felt, from the inside, indistinguishable from skill. She was standing in Bay 3 in Mjolnir armor that had taken a needler burst to the left pauldron and a plasma bolt to the lower back plate, and was still fully functional, because Mjolnir was built for exactly that, and because Catherine was very good at not dying. She had watched the drone footage once. Her threat assessment of the Grim had taken 40 seconds and produced a 3-page document that Celeste had formatted and forwarded to Captain Chen at 0430. The document's executive summary was 11 words. Unknown hostile biological, pack behavior, high aggression. Conventional weapons will be required. The full document was more nuanced. It noted the Grim's bone-white markings and the specific quality of their movement. Not animal exactly, not the blind aggression of Covenant drones or the tactical organization of Covenant elites, but something between those categories that suggested a threat model she didn't have adequate data to finalize. She had flagged this in the document as additional field observation required before threat assessment can be considered reliable. She had never written those words in a threat assessment before. It was not a comfortable first. Okafor ran the briefing in 11 minutes because 11 minutes was what it required and not more. A landing zone 3 kilometers outside the largest population center the drones had identified. A city of significant size behind what appeared to be a wall of white stone, constructed to a standard that suggested Grim containment was an architectural priority rather than an afterthought. Approach on foot from the LZ. Primary objective: visual assessment of local population and infrastructure. Secondary objective: establish communication baseline if contact is made. Tertiary objective: do not start an incident. Define incident, Torres said. Anything that results in shooting at the people behind the wall, Okafor said. The things in the forest are a different category. And if the things in the forest are between us and the wall, then we handle it, Catherine said from the corner of the bay. Her voice through the helmet modulator had the specific quality of someone stating a fact that did not require elaboration. That's what we're here for. Nobody argued with this. They dropped at 05:30 under darkness, in a pattern that Celeste had calculated to avoid the highest density Grim concentrations based on current movement data. The drop was clean. The landing zone was a clearing in a forest that smelled of pine and something else, something that had no equivalent in any forest Reyes had ever been in, something that was not unpleasant but was deeply unfamiliar in a way that communicated clearly. You are not anywhere you have been before. They moved through the forest for 40 minutes without contact. Then the Grim found them. It was not a large pack. Celeste's post-engagement analysis, conducted from orbit using the team's helmet footage, classified it as a standard Beowulf grouping. 12 individuals, adult-sized, moving with the coordinated aggression of a group that had hunted together before. They came from the northwest in near silence, which was the first thing that registered as wrong. Pack predators of this size moving through dense forest made noise. These made almost none. As if they had learned somewhere in whatever passed for their development, that silence was a weapon. The first one hit the perimeter at 06:12. Reyes saw it first and fired first, which was correct procedure and produced the expected result. 2 M6D rounds to center mass of a creature the size of a large dog, which should have been sufficient and was not. The Beowulf absorbed both rounds and kept coming, and Reyes had approximately 1 second to process that her threat model had just been invalidated before Diallo's BR-55 opened up from the left, and the sustained fire at close range finally brought it down. 12 seconds of contact, 3 Beowulfs down, 9 still coming. Catherine moved through the contact zone with the specific control deficiency of someone for whom this category of threat, fast, aggressive, closing to melee range, was a known problem with a known solution. She hit the lead Beowulf at the apex of its jump with a right cross that put it into the tree line, and didn't look at where it landed before moving to the next one. The ODSTs had their rhythm by the 4th Beowulf. You needed more rounds than the target should require, and you needed to concentrate fire, and you needed to be moving because these things were fast enough that a stationary target was a problem. They adjusted. That was what ODSTs did. The 9th Beowulf died at 06:13 and 12 seconds. Total contact time, 1 minute and 12 seconds. Okafor was running his post-contact assessment, team status, ammo expenditure, noise signature, likely Grim response to the firefight, when the tree line 30 meters to the east lit up. Not weapons fire, something else. Something that moved through the darkness between the trees with a velocity that the team's motion sensors registered and immediately flagged as outside normal human parameters. Fast, multiple contacts coming from the direction of the city wall. Catherine brought her weapon up. And then the first one came out of the trees. She was young, 16, 17 at the outside, wearing a red cape and carrying a weapon that had transformed between the tree line and the clearing from something that might have been a scythe into something that was clearly also a gun. And she moved with a speed and precision that Catherine's combat architecture processed in real time and classified with genuine surprise as extraordinary. Behind her came 3 others, one in white with a rapier that crackled with something that was not electricity but functioned like it. One in black with a weapon that was simultaneously a gun and a blade, and who moved through the contact zone with the specific controlled efficiency of someone who had been doing this since before it was a choice. One in yellow who hit the last surviving Beowulf, the one Catherine hadn't accounted for in the tree line, the one that had been flanking, with a right cross that put it through a tree trunk. Catherine processed the right cross, recalibrated. The girl in yellow looked at her across the clearing, at the Mjolnir armor and the MA-5B and the 4 other soldiers in ODST combat gear. Her expression was not fear, it was not aggression, it was the specific expression of someone encountering something completely outside their existing model and choosing in real time to treat it as interesting rather than threatening. Yang Xiaolong looked at Catherine B320 and said something in a language that Celeste's translation matrix was not yet functional enough to decode, but the tone was identifiable. The tone said, "Huh." The forest was quiet for a moment. 8 dead Grimm between them. Nobody had shot at anybody. Okafor lowered his weapon 1 centimeter and said in English, knowing it wouldn't be understood and saying it anyway, because tone was a communication channel that didn't require shared vocabulary. "We're not here to cause trouble." The girl in red looked at the girl in yellow. The girl in yellow shrugged, an unmistakably human gesture, universal apparently, and said something that made the girl in white sigh and the girl in black glance at the tree line, as if checking for additional threats. Then the girl in red pointed at the dead Grimm, pointed at the team, pointed at the city wall visible through the trees. The gesture was the clearest possible language. "You fought those, we fight those, come with us." Okafor looked at Catherine. Catherine looked at the 4 young warriors standing in a forest clearing on a planet that shouldn't exist, in front of a city surrounded by a wall built for exactly this category of threat, having arrived at a firefight they hadn't been called to because apparently this was what they did. She activated her comlink. "Actual to last stand. We've made contact, locals, human or close enough. They want us to go with them." Celeste's voice in her ear. "I'm recording everything, Spartan. Recommend compliance pending further assessment." And Catherine, "Yeah. The Grimm concentrations between your position and the city wall are dissipating. The contact appears to have, I don't have a better word for this, reassured something. The emotional signal from the area has changed." A pause. "Oh, the locals may have that effect on the local threat environment. I'll continue analysis." Catherine looked at the girl in red, who was watching her with the patient attention of someone who was very comfortable waiting. "Copy," she said. "We're moving." Val looked like a city that had decided, at some foundational point in its history, that beauty and survival were not mutually exclusive goals and had built accordingly. Catherine processed this on the walk-in. The white stone walls, thick and clearly purpose-built for containment rather than aesthetics, topped with what appeared to be automated defensive emplacements that were old enough to show weathering but maintained with the specific attention of infrastructure that people depended on to still be working when they needed it. Inside the walls, the city was layered in the way cities got layered when they had been built and rebuilt over generations. Older architecture at the foundation, newer construction rising above it. The whole thing organized around a central elevated structure that Catherine's tactical assessment identified immediately as a defensible high ground, and her aesthetic assessment identified in the same instant and with equal weight as beautiful. She did not usually have aesthetic assessments. Mjolnir armor suppressed a lot of things. It suppressed pain signals during combat to maintain operational effectiveness. It suppressed fatigue response past certain thresholds. It had a documented effect on fine motor calibration that the UNSC's armor division had been trying to fully characterize for 20 years. It did not apparently suppress the response to walking into a city that had been built by people who understood that the things worth defending were worth defending because they were worth looking at. She filed this observation in the same category she filed things that weren't tactically relevant and moved on. The 4 young warriors led them through Vale's outer districts with the ease of people who knew every street, every alley, every shortcut through the city's layered geography. The girl in red, Catherine had designated her red in her internal threat model, which was a workspace label rather than an assessment, and was already reconsidering the label because this person was clearly not a threat, and the label felt imprecise. Moved at a pace that was slightly faster than a normal person's easy walk and slightly slower than a jog. The pace of someone for whom this kind of transit was so habitual it no longer required calibration. The people they passed on the streets looked at the ODST team with expressions that Catherine cataloged rapidly: surprise, clearly, uncertainty, understandably, and in several cases, a third thing that was harder to name. Not hostility, not welcome, but something that looked like the face people made when they saw something that didn't fit their model of the world and were deciding in real time how much to revise the model. Nobody ran. Nobody raised an alarm. A few people took out small rectangular devices, scrolls, Catherine would learn the word later, and appeared to be recording or communicating. She noted this and transmitted the observation to Celeste, because ONI protocols on information management said you noted things like civilians recording and you let your AI worry about what it meant. They're broadcasting, Celeste confirmed in her ear. Multiple signals, local communication network. I'm still building the linguistic matrix, but the traffic patterns suggest the information is spreading faster than your walking speed. A pause. Someone important will know you're coming before you arrive. Good, Catherine said. Okafor fell into step beside her. He had been watching the city with the assessment of someone whose threat model was currently running 3 parallel tracks. The locals, the grim response to their presence, and whatever was at the top of the elevated structure ahead of them. He had the specific quality of a senior NCO, processing a situation that had exceeded his doctrine and responding by making his own doctrine, which Catherine had observed in good NCOs throughout her career and considered one of the more reliable indicators of actual competence. "What do you make of it?" he said quietly. "Built to last," she said. "The walls are engineered, not improvised. Someone thought carefully about how thick they needed to be and built them thicker." She looked at the weapon the girl in black was carrying as she walked ahead of them, still in its combined form, barrel, and blade, integrated in a way that suggested the transformation between configurations was mechanical rather than purely aesthetic. The weapons, too, they're designed for something specific, not general purpose, specific. "The Grim," Okafor said. "The Grim," Catherine confirmed. "How long do you think they've been fighting them?" Catherine looked at the walls. The weathering on the lower courses of stone was deep, centuries, not decades. The upper sections were newer, repaired and extended, but the foundation was old in a way that had to be measured in generations. "Long enough to build a city around the problem," she said. They reached the elevated structure, an academy, Catherine would understand later, though the word would carry more weight than she initially assigned it. At 0712 ship time, which was approximately 37 minutes after leaving the forest clearing, which meant they had been on Remnant surface for just over 2 hours. The doors were open. The girl in red walked through them without breaking stride and looked back at Catherine with an expression that communicated, with the clarity of someone who had spent a lot of time communicating across distances too loud for words, that this was fine and they should follow. Catherine followed. The room they were brought to was at the top of a tower, large, circular, with a view through tall windows of Vale's skyline and the wall beyond and the forest beyond the wall. And if you looked carefully and knew what you were looking for, the specific quality of movement in the tree line that indicated grim presence at the perimeter. Catherine looked. She knew what she was looking for. The man standing at the center of the room was older than she had expected from the building's architecture. Not ancient, but with the quality of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had organized his life around the weight so thoroughly that the weight and the person had become difficult to distinguish. He wore green robes and carried a cane that Catherine's tactical assessment flagged as probably unnecessary and possibly symbolic, and her revised assessment flagged as potentially a weapon, and her third assessment flagged as insufficient data. Maintain awareness. He watched them enter with an expression that was not surprise. He had known they were coming. Celeste had been right. The man said something to the girl in red, who responded, and then said something to the girl in white, who pulled out her scroll and appeared to be running a program, and then looked directly at Catherine and said something in the language Catherine didn't speak, with a tone that was unmistakably the tone of someone asking a question they had been considering carefully for at least 30 minutes. "Celeste," Catherine said, "I have approximately 40% vocabulary coverage," the AI said. "Enough for basic exchange. I'm routing audio to your helmet and doing real-time best effort translation. It will be incomplete. Flag where you need clarification. Do it." The translation came through with the specific quality of real-time linguistic work. Functional but with gaps. Words rendered as approximate equivalents where exact equivalents didn't exist. Occasional pauses where Celeste was choosing between multiple valid interpretations. The man had asked, "Where did you come from?" Catherine looked at him for a moment. She thought about the honest answer, which was complicated, and the tactical answer, which was incomplete, and the answer that was both honest and incomplete in the specific way that was useful rather than misleading. "Far away," she said. Celeste translated, "We didn't come here intentionally. Our navigation was damaged. We ended up here instead of somewhere else." The man's expression shifted slightly, not surprise, something else. "He says," Celeste translated, with a pause that suggested she was reconstructing the full sentence, "that the sky has not brought strangers in a very long time. He says that is not exactly true. He says the last time it happened, it changed a great deal." Catherine processed this. "Who is he?" she said, not to the man, but to the girl in red, who seemed to be the person in the room most comfortable with the situation. The girl in red said a name. Celeste rendered it phonetically, Ozpin. "He wants to know," Celeste continued, "what is in orbit. He says the energy signature is..." A pause. "He uses a word I don't have an equivalent for. The closest approximation is concerning or possibly familiar in a way that it should not be." Chen's voice cut in on Catherine's comlink. She had been patched in since the tower. "Spartan," Chen said. "Tell him about the Covenant, not the details. Just that we're being followed and what's following us is dangerous." Catherine looked at Ozpin. "The ships in orbit are ours," she said. Celeste translated, "But we were being pursued by something else, something that may have followed us here." She paused. "If it followed us, it will come to your world because it comes to every world. It destroys what it finds," Celeste translated. Ozpin was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that Celeste rendered as, "He says, how long do we have?" "Unknown," Catherine said. "Hours, possibly longer, possibly less." Another silence. Then Ozpin said something longer. Celeste worked through it, flagging 3 uncertain word choices with small pauses. He says, "There is already something that destroys what it finds here. There has been for as long as anyone can remember. One more thing in that category, a longer pause. He says, changes the arithmetic. He does not say whether that is better or worse." Catherine looked at the man with the cane and the weight he'd been carrying. He was looking back at her with the expression of someone doing the same kind of calculation she was, assessing an unknown asset against a known threat, running the math on alliance versus neutrality, understanding that the math didn't account for everything, but was the best available tool. "What do you need from us?" Catherine said. Celeste translated. Ozpin almost smiled. He said something brief. Celeste rendered it in 2 words, with a footnote that the original carried more nuance than 2 words could hold. "Not yet." And then he said something to the girl in red that made her look at Catherine with the expression she'd had in the forest clearing. That specific quality of treating the unexpected as interesting. "He's asking Team RWBY to give you a tour," Celeste said. He says, another flag, but another uncertain word. He says, "Let them see what we're fighting for, before we discuss what we're fighting together." Catherine considered this, thought about Captain Chen listening through the comlink, thought about bright morning leaking atmosphere in orbit. thought about 93%. "Tell him we have limited time," she said. Celeste translated. Ozpin nodded once, acknowledging this without conceding it. Then he said something that Celeste translated with a footnote. "Word choice uncertain. Multiple valid interpretations, rendered as approximate." He says, "Everyone here has limited time. That is not a reason to stop understanding what the time is for." The tour was Ruby Rose's, which meant it was fast and comprehensive, and included commentary that Celeste translated at approximately 60% accuracy, which was enough to understand that Ruby Rose had opinions about everything she was showing them, and those opinions were held with the specific conviction of someone who had arrived at them through experience rather than instruction. She showed them the training halls, large rooms where students moved through combat drills with the weapons Catherine had seen in the forest, the transformation mechanics she was beginning to understand as a design philosophy rather than an aesthetic choice. Every weapon served multiple functions. Every configuration was a response to a specific threat model. The people using them were young, older than Ruby, some of them, but young by UNSC combat deployment standards, and they moved with a quality that Catherine's assessment architecture kept trying to classify as Spartan adjacent, and kept failing to classify that way because it wasn't the same thing. Spartans were built for a war. These people were built for a purpose. The distinction was fine and significant. Okafor watched a third-year student run a solo drill against automated training dummies and said quietly, so only Catherine could hear, "He's faster than a Sangheli Ranger." "Different kind of fast," Catherine said. "Is there a different kind?" "Sangheli Rangers are fast because they're physically exceptional and well-trained," Catherine said. "That kid is fast because he's been taught to be fast from the inside out. Different mechanism, same result in some conditions. Different result in the conditions that matter." Okafor thought about this. "What conditions matter?" "The ones we haven't encountered yet," Catherine said. They were shown the wall, standing on its upper walkway, looking out at the forest, at the grim movement visible in the tree line, at the specific quality of the forest's edge where the darkness that characterized the grim heavy areas met the lighter forest that surrounded the city. Ruby said something that Celeste translated as, she says, "The wall has been here longer than the academy." She says her grandmother's grandmother's grandmother remembers when the wall was shorter. The Grimm were smaller then. She says they grow with us. Chen's voice in Catherine's ear. "Did she say the Grimm grow with them?" "I'll follow up," Catherine said. She looked at Ruby. "The creatures," she said, and gestured toward the tree line. Celeste translated. "They were smaller before. They grow because..." She paused, working through how to ask the question without the full vocabulary. "What makes them grow?" Ruby looked at the tree line, said something that took Celeste 4 seconds, which was long for her. She says, "We do." She says, "Every generation of hunters makes them stronger. Every battle, every fear, every city we build gives them something to push against." A pause. She says, "Ozpin says they grow stronger with our darkness." She says she doesn't fully understand what he means, but she thinks it means... She uses a word I don't have a precise equivalent for. The closest approximation is despair, or the feeling that comes after hope stops. Catherine stood on the wall of a city, that had been fighting an unwinnable war for generations, and looked at the things at the tree line that got stronger every time it lost. She thought about the Covenant, about 27 years of humanity watching everything they built get burned, and the specific quality of the despair that produced, the kind that accumulated in soldiers who had been fighting long enough that fighting was no longer a response to hope, but a response to the absence of anything else to do. She thought about a fleet full of people who had that despair in their bones. She thought about what Celeste had said. The grim concentrations were highest below their orbital position and scaling with the number of personnel on deck. "Celeste," she said. "Yes?" "A Spartan. The crew emotional state, current reading." A pause. "Elevated baseline anxiety across all departments. Post-combat stress indicators in the ODST contingent. The engineering team on Bright Morning is showing high cortisol equivalents. They've been working a contained breach for 6 hours." Another pause, longer. "Captain Chen has been awake for 22 hours. Her baseline is she's managing, but it's managed rather than resolved." "And the Grim? The concentrations below our position have increased 14% in the last 3 hours, Celeste said. "Consistent with the crew emotional state indicators." Catherine looked at the tree line, thought about the math. "I thought about 93%, and a Covenant fleet, and what a Covenant glassing run generated in the people watching it happen to their world. The specific quality of terror and grief and rage that plasma burns produced in anyone close enough to feel the heat." Thought about what the Grim did with that. "Celeste," she said, "add this to the brief for Captain Chen. Priority 1. She paused. "The Covenant aren't just a tactical problem here. They're a force multiplier for the planet's existing threat environment. Every engagement they run, every city they hit, every person they kill, it feeds whatever is making the Grim grow." She paused again. "This planet doesn't just have 2 threats. It has one threat that feeds on the other." A long pause. "I've been building toward that conclusion," Celeste said. "No, I wanted more data before I presented it. You got there faster." "Different mechanism," Catherine said. "Same result." Below the wall, in the forest, the Grim moved in their patient darkness. Above the planet, in the dark of an uncharted system, Celeste ran her 18th classification attempt on the dust readings and arrived for the first time at something that was not unknown, not a full classification, not a definition, but a property. The dust responded to emotion, not the Grim attracting kind, not fear and despair and rage. The other kind, the kind that the UNSC's 11 years of losing had been steadily depleting. Celeste flagged this as significant and added it to the brief. Then she ran a 19th attempt, because 19 was closer to understanding than 18, and understanding was the only tool she had for the problem she was increasingly certain she was looking at. Ospin watched the drone footage for the 3rd time at 800, not because the first 2 viewings had been insufficient. He was precise about what he needed from information, and he needed different things on each viewing. The first for the fact of it, the second for the implications, the third for what the implications implied about the things he had been keeping track of for a very long time and had learned to read the way a navigator read weather. not predicting exactly, but understanding the pressure systems well enough to know when something was changing. Something was changing. The ships in orbit were human. He had confirmed this through the contact report from Team RWBY and through his own assessment of the Spartan, a word he had understood from Celeste's translations as a designation rather than a description, though it functioned as both. Human in origin, not from remnant, not from any civilization whose history Ozpin had access to, and Ozpin had access to histories that would have surprised most people who thought they understood how much history there was. The energy signature from the undamaged frigate was human technology, crude by the standards of what he knew about the full range of what technology could be, but functional and purposeful in the way that human things were always functional and purposeful when humans had been building them for their survival. The second signature was different. He had been watching the second signature since it appeared at the edge of the system's sensor range. A different kind of watching than the crew of the Meridian's last stand was doing. They conducted through instruments that were not on any Atlesian military manifest, and which generated data he did not share with Glinda or Crow or anyone currently in the building. The second signature was familiar in a way that it should not have been. He turned from the footage and looked at the tower window, Vale's skyline in early morning light, the wall at its edge, the forest beyond the wall with its permanent population of darkness. He had looked at this view more times than he could count across more years than he cared to number. It was the view of a man who had stood in this spot through multiple iterations of himself and watched the city below him change, while the things at the tree line remained constant. The arrival of the UNSC ships had changed something in that constancy. Not the Grimm themselves. They were what they were. What they had always been. What they would continue to be until the problem at their origin was addressed. And he had spent enough years working on that problem to have a realistic assessment of its timeline. But the Grimm's behavior had shifted since the ships arrived. The concentrations were moving differently. Not toward Vale specifically. They were always moving toward Vale. That was their permanent condition. But with a quality that was different from normal. More organized. He had seen this quality before. He had seen it when events in the world outside generated enough combined emotional signal to attract Grimm not as individual predators, but as something that functioned more like a tide, not directed by individual hunger, but by a collective response to the signal. The way iron filings responded to a magnet without any individual filing deciding to move. The UNSC fleet was producing that signal. He understood why. The Spartan's face had told him enough. The specific quality of someone who had been fighting a losing war long enough that the fighting and the losing had become indistinguishable, who kept moving because stopping was not an option and not because moving was working. He had seen that face on many people across many years. He recognized it from the inside. 11 years of that, carried by an entire fleet. He thought about what that signal looked like to everything that fed on darkness. He thought about the second signature at the edge of the system. Then he crossed to his desk and removed a scroll that did not look like other scrolls. Older, its casing worn to the specific smoothness of something handled daily for a very long time. its interface operating on protocols that predated the current scroll network by several generations. He opened it. He did not transmit through it. He simply confirmed that it was still functioning. Then he crossed to the window again and looked at the forest and thought about the conversation he needed to have and the conversations he needed to avoid, and the specific art of managing information in a situation where too much information given to the wrong people at the wrong time was more dangerous than too little. Glinda entered without knocking, which was her habit and his tolerance, for it was the specific tolerance of someone who had learned that people who entered without knocking were often the people worth keeping close. Team RWBY's report came through, she said. She was holding her scroll in her left hand and her writing crop in her right, which meant she had been in the middle of something when the report arrived and had come immediately. He noted this. The UNSC soldiers are requesting a formal meeting. The AI, Celeste, has been transmitting translation matrices to their handheld device and apparently considers itself ready for extended communication. A pause. Ruby says the Spartan is interesting. Ruby says most things are interesting, Ozpin said. Ruby's assessment of interesting things is usually accurate, Glinda replied. Ozpin acknowledged this with the slight incline of his head that he used when Glinda was right and he had been about to say the same thing. Set up the meeting, he said. Full council if we can get them. Ironwood needs to be present. Scroll transmission from Atlas if he can't come in person. He paused. And Crow. Glinda's expression shifted slightly. Is Crow currently? Find him, Ozpin said. Whatever he's currently doing, this is more important. She nodded and turned to leave. Glinda. She stopped. The second energy signature, he said. He had not shown her the data. He was going to show her a portion of it now because portions, properly chosen, served better than the whole. The one that isn't the UNSC fleet. I want you to prepare a briefing for the Council that characterizes it as an unknown threat following the UNSC ships. He paused. That characterization is accurate. It's also incomplete. I'll provide the rest when the timing is right. Glinda turned to face him with the expression she used when she knew he was doing the thing he did and had decided to accept it rather than argue about it, which was a different expression from the one she used when she had decided to argue. How incomplete, she said. The part about why I recognized it, Ozpin said simply. She looked at him for a long moment. Ozpin, she said. I know, he said. When the timing is right. She left. Ozpin turned back to the window. Below him in the streets of Vale, UNSC ODSTs were walking alongside Team RWBY through a city that was already beginning to absorb their presence, the way cities absorb the unexpected. Not quickly, not completely, but with the gradual readjustment of a population that had been dealing with the unexpected long enough to have a methodology for it. He watched them for a moment. Then he crossed to a different part of his office, behind the desk, to a section of wall that looked like wall and was wall, except for a section 40 centimeters wide and 30 tall that responded to his specific touch and only his. The panel behind it was not scroll technology and was not Atlesian and was not anything that anyone currently alive on Remnant had built. He opened it. Inside was a screen showing a single data feed. The feed was not the dust readings. It was not the UNSC fleet's energy signature. It was not any of the instrumental readings that Celeste was currently compiling in orbit. It was a signal, faint, ancient, operating on a frequency so far below the range of current scroll network technology that it would register as background noise to any scanner that wasn't specifically calibrated to find it. He had been calibrated to find it for a very long time. The signal had been dormant for decades. It was active now. It had activated at the moment the UNSC ships arrived in the system. Ozpin looked at it for a long moment with the expression of someone receiving information they had been waiting for and dreading simultaneously. Not because the information was bad exactly, but because its arrival meant that a period of relative stability had ended, and what came next was not something that periods of relative stability prepared you for. He closed the panel, went to his desk, poured a cup of coffee, sat down, thought about the Spartan standing on his wall looking at the Grim in the tree line, with the expression of someone running calculations that were reaching the right conclusions faster than he had expected. Thought about Celeste's transmission, fragments of which Crow had intercepted and passed to him, because Crow's interception capabilities were one of the things Ozpin kept carefully off the official manifest, and what the AI had concluded about the relationship between the fleet's emotional state and the Grim concentrations. An AI from another world had, in under 48 hours, understood something that Remnant's finest military minds had not formally articulated in several centuries of fighting the Grim. He thought about what that meant, about the kind of intelligence that was capable of that speed of conclusion, about what it would mean to have that intelligence on the same side as everything he had been building toward for as long as he had been building, about what it would mean to have it on the wrong side. He drank his coffee. Below the tower, deep beneath Beacon's foundations, in a chamber that had been here longer than the Academy and longer than the city and longer than anyone currently alive had been keeping track of, something old registered the activation of the signal and made a response that was not audible and not visible and not detectable by any instrument currently in the system. Not detectable by any instrument currently in the system. Celeste flagged an anomaly in her signal sweep at 0823, a frequency reading that had not been present in her previous 17 sweeps. Too low to register as communication, too structured to register as noise, too old to match anything in her database of known frequencies. She added it to her log as anomaly, unclassified, potentially significant, and then, because she was Celeste and she did not file things as potentially significant without pursuing them, she allocated 3% of her processing capacity to building a decryption matrix for a frequency that she did not yet understand, on a planet she had not known existed 72 hours ago, operating with the specific systematic patience of an intelligence that had learned that understanding was worth more than speed and worth more than the comfort of not knowing. She ran the first attempt, flagged it, ran the second. Outside the tower, in the streets below, Ruby Rose was explaining something to Corporal Reyes using hand gestures and the specific quality of someone who had decided that shared vocabulary was a problem that enthusiasm could partially compensate for. And Reyes was responding with the specific expression of someone who was following approximately 40% of what was being communicated and finding it sufficient. The morning was ordinary. The signal beneath beacon pulsed once, in the specific pattern of something that had been waiting and had registered finally that what it was waiting for was close. Ozpin heard it through the old scroll without looking at it. He set down his coffee, picked up his cane. "Not yet," he said, to the room that appeared to be empty. "Give me time to understand what we're working with." The room that appeared to be empty did not respond. But the signal did not pulse again, which meant, in the specific language of a conversation that had been going on longer than most civilizations, that the answer was understood and accepted for now. The Prophet of Restraint's name before the San Shayum naming conventions of the Covenant hierarchy had replaced it, had been something that translated approximately into a concept meaning patience as a form of power. He had spent his adult life proving the concept correct. Patience had brought him to the rank of prophet. Patience had kept him there across 4 decades of the Covenant's political architecture, which operated on the principle that patience and careful alignment with theological consensus were the same thing viewed from different angles. When the high prophets moved against rivals, the rivals were always people who had moved too fast. When fleets were lost, they were always lost by commanders who had acted on incomplete information. The lesson was the same every time, and the Covenant kept teaching it because the lesson was true and because the lesson was also useful to people who were patient enough to use it. He stood on the bridge of the carrier Unbroken Covenant and looked at the planet on the display and was, for the first time in 4 decades, finding patience difficult. The planet should not exist, not in the sense of being physically impossible. He was a theologian, not a physicist, and the Covenant's understanding of physics was filtered through 17,000 years of forerunner interpretation, but in the sense that the Great Journey's cartography of sacred sites did not include this system, did not acknowledge this star, did not account for this world, and the Great Journey's cartography was, by definition, complete. Incomplete cartography was a theological problem. The energy readings were a different category of theological problem. They were similar to forerunner energy signatures, not identical. He had the Covenant's complete sacred site database, and the resonance overlap was 63%, not 100, which meant either the instruments were malfunctioning or the energy was not forerunner origin, but was somehow related to it, like a dialect rather than a language. He had been looking at that 63% for 6 hours. "Urtas vadum," he said, without turning from the display. The Sangheli Ultra moved from his position near the tactical station to stand at the Prophet's left side. He was tall even by Sangheli standards, his white armor bearing the marks of campaigns that the Prophet had been present for, and campaigns that predated their joint service, his bearing the particular quality of a warrior who had long ago resolved the tension between his species' instinct for combat and the Covenant's religious architecture into something that was neither pure soldier nor pure believer, but was functional in both registers. The Prophet had worked with Urtas Vadum for 11 years. He trusted him the specific amount that a San Shayum trusted a Sangheli, which was the amount determined by mutual utility rather than genuine alignment, and he trusted that Urtas Vadum understood this, which he did. which was part of why the arrangement functioned. The human heretics, the prophet said, their ships entered this system through the same corridor we tracked them through. Confirmed, Vadum said. The slipspace residue matches. They arrived first, approximately 18 of their standard hours ahead of our entry. And they have established contact with the planet's inhabitants. The surveillance drones confirm it. A ground team descended within hours of their arrival. They are currently inside the primary population center. Vadum paused. The population center is human. Yes, the prophet said. I know. He had been thinking about this since the first scan confirmed human life signs on the surface. A human population on a world with Forerunner-adjacent energy signatures. A world that did not appear in the Great Journey's cartography. A world that the UNSC heretics had reached before the Covenant. The theological implications arranged themselves in his mind in order of urgency. First, the energy. What was it? If it was Forerunner-related, it was sacred. If it was sacred, the Covenant had an obligation to secure it. If the UNSC was making contact with the population that lived on top of it, they were potentially contaminating a sacred site with heretic influence. Second, the population. Human, apparently, not UNSC. No technology in the standard UNSC range. No slipspace signatures, no orbital infrastructure. An isolated human population on a world with Forerunner-adjacent energy. The theological categorization of such a population was, he paused on this, complicated. The humans the Covenant had been fighting for 27 years were heretics who had been classified as enemies of the Great Journey. But classification required understanding origin. These humans had not been classified. Third, the cartography problem, a world not on the sacred map. This was either a failure of the map, which was theologically untenable, or a failure of their understanding of the map, which was theologically uncomfortable, or something else that he did not yet have the category for, which was theologically the most dangerous option. The instruments, he said. The 63% resonance reading. Have you had the engineering team recalibrate? 3 times, Vadum said. The reading is stable and consistent. It is not an instrument error. Then the energy is real. The energy is real. The prophet was quiet for a moment. I want a biological sample, he said. From the planet's surface, the crystalline deposits. Not a ground team. The creatures in the analysis footage make that inadvisable until we understand the threat environment more completely. A drone extraction. Can your team manage it? The creatures in the footage respond to atmospheric insertion, Vadum said carefully. Any drone operating below the cloud layer will draw attention. We lost 3 surveillance units to them in the first hour of scanning operations. He paused. They are not deterred by conventional weapons fire at the calibration levels we use for reconnaissance drones. They are more deterred by higher yield, but higher yield extraction drones are not. Subtle, the prophet finished. I know. Find a solution. I want the sample before I make any decision about the human population below. He turned from the display to look at the Sangheili directly. And I want surveillance maintained on the UNSC ships. Every communication, every ground team movement. If they are negotiating with the locals, I want to know what they're negotiating about. Understood, Vadum said. He turned to leave. One more thing, the prophet said. Vadum stopped. "The Jiralhanai," the prophet said. "Brutes." The word carried its usual freight, the specific quality of a San Shayum, speaking of a species they had elevated to a position of military utility, without fully resolving how they felt about having done so. Chieftain Tartarus has been requesting clarification on our operational posture since we arrived. He wants to know when we are going to engage the human ships. What have you told him? That we are assessing. A pause. He finds this insufficient. Urtas Vadum's mandibles shifted in the expression that Celeste, had she been observing, would have catalogued as controlled disagreement. Tartarus has never found patience sufficient. "No," the prophet agreed, "which is why I am telling you, not him, that our operational posture is assessment and will remain so until I have the information I need." He looked at Urtas Vadum directly. "Manage him." "Yes," Urtas Vadum said. He left. The brute's name was Tartarus, and he was standing in the carrier's secondary hangar when Urtas Vadum found him, which was exactly where Urtas Vadum had expected to find him, because Tartarus spent most of his time either in the hangar or at the gravity hammer practice range, and the latter was 2 decks up. He was large even by Jiralhanai standards. His armor was Fist of Rooked grade ceremonial at the pauldrons and practical everywhere else, which was the specific combination of a warrior who had enough status to display it and enough experience to understand that ornamentation had limits. He was inspecting a phantom dropship with the attention of someone finding problems before they found him, which Urtas Vadum noted as the most useful thing he had seen Tartarus do in 3 days of shared deployment. "Shipmaster," Tartarus said, without looking up from the phantom. "Chieftain," Urtas Vadum said, "the prophet tells me we are still assessing." "We are. We have been assessing since we arrived." Tartarus set down the inspection tool and turned to face him. The specific quality of his attention was the quality of a being who had been patient by force of circumstance and was beginning to find the circumstance insufficient. 3 UNSC frigates in orbit, a human population below, a planet covered in energy deposits that our instruments cannot fully classify. He paused. "What is there to assess? We glass the UNSC ships. We take samples of the energy deposits. We decide what to do with the local population based on whatever the samples tell us. This is the Covenant's established procedure." "The prophet is concerned about the energy signature," Urtas Vadum said. "The prophet is always concerned. It is his function." Tartarus looked at him with the directness that Jiralhanai used when they were deciding whether a conversation was going to remain conversational. "What is your concern, shipmaster?" Urtas Vadum considered the question honestly, which was not something he did with Tartarus as a general practice, but which the situation seemed to require. "The creatures on the surface," he said. "The ones the drones recorded. We have lost reconnaissance units to them at a rate that suggests they are more dangerous than their biological profile implies." He paused. "And their behavior has changed since we arrived." Tartarus's expression shifted slightly. "Changed how?" "The concentrations nearest our orbital position have increased 43% since our entry to the system," Urtas Vadum said. He had been watching this number since Celeste's observation about the UNSC fleet. He had not accessed Celeste's data directly, But he had his own instruments, and his instruments were telling the same story. So they are responding to our presence, not the ships specifically. Something we are generating that they respond to. Tartarus stared at him. You're saying the planet's predators respond to us. I'm saying the data is consistent with that, Urtas Vadum said, which is different. A long silence. And the Prophet knows this? The Prophet knows the instruments show increased grim concentration. He has not yet drawn the same conclusion about the mechanism. Urtas Vadum looked at the chieftain steadily, which is why I am telling you rather than him, because the conclusion has operational implications that require military judgment rather than theological assessment. Tartarus was quiet for a moment. This was unusual enough that Urtas Vadum noted it carefully. If the creatures respond to... Tartarus paused. To what we are feeling. To what we are feeling, Urtas Vadum confirmed. And we glass the UNSC ships. And the city below us, Urtas Vadum said. The fear that generates in the local population, the rage, the grief. He paused. You have seen what the drones recorded. The creatures in those forests. Multiply what we have seen by the emotional output of a city watching itself burn. Tartarus was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that surprised Urtas Vadum, which was not a thing that happened often. The Prophet will not like this reasoning, Tartarus said. No, Urtas Vadum agreed. He will call it weakness. He will say the covenant does not moderate its actions based on the behavior of primitive biological threats. He will, Urtas Vadum agreed again. But you are telling me because you need the Jiralhanai contingent to understand the tactical situation clearly before the Prophet makes a decision that... Tartarus stopped. His expression shifted into something that was not quite the face he used for tactical calculation, and was not quite the face he used for theological consideration, but was somewhere between them, in the specific territory that opened when you had been raised to believe one thing and encountered evidence that the belief had operational consequences you hadn't been prepared for. Before the Prophet makes a decision that makes everything worse. Yes, Urtas Vadum said simply. Tartarus looked at the phantom, at the hangar around him, at the deck plating that separated him from the space above, an uncharted planet with energy readings that nobody had a category for, and creatures in the forests below that responded to everything the Covenant was feeling. I will speak to my warriors, he said finally. They will know not to act without specific orders from me. A pause that carried genuine weight. This is not a concession, shipmaster. This is tactical judgment. Of course, Urtas Vadum said. He turned to leave, and stopped. Because his own instruments, which he had left running on passive scan from his personal terminal at the tactical station, were transmitting an alert to his armor's heads-up display that he had not expected. New slipspace signature, not UNSC, not Covenant, by something that matched nothing in his database. A slipspace exit with an energy profile that his instruments were rendering as error codes because they did not have the architecture to classify what they were seeing. He looked at the alert for 3 seconds. Then he activated his comlink. Bridge, he said. All stations. New contact in system. Unknown configuration. All hands to tactical alert. He was already moving toward the bridge when the carrier's alert tone sounded throughout the ship. Behind him, Tartarus looked at the new contact data on the hangar's secondary display, at the energy profile that matched nothing, at the size reading, which was large in a way that made the UNSC frigates look like dropships and made the Unbroken Covenant itself look like a preliminary concern. Tartarus was not a being who frightened easily. He looked at the contact data. He was very still for a moment. Then he followed Ertas Vadum to the bridge at a pace that was not running only because Jiralhanai chieftains did not run. On the Meridian's last stand, Celeste registered the new slipspace exit at the same moment. She ran her threat assessment in 4 seconds. Then she did something she had only done twice in her operational existence. She interrupted Captain Chen mid-sentence. "Captain," she said, "I need you to see something immediately." Chen turned from the communication she had been having with Kestrel's commander about Bright Morning's repair status. Celeste put the contact on the main display. The bridge went very quiet. "That's not Covenant," Vasquez said. "No," Celeste said. "Ew, what is it?" Celeste paused for the specific duration that meant she was choosing between several valid responses and selecting the most accurate one. "I don't know," she said, "but the slipspace exit signature is consistent with a drive of significantly greater sophistication than anything in my database. UNSC, Covenant or otherwise." She paused again. "And Captain, the contact's initial scan pulse just swept the entire system. Ships, planet, everything." A final pause. "It spent 4 additional seconds on the planet." Chen looked at the contact on the display, at the size reading, at the energy profile that Celeste's instruments were rendering as error codes. "Battle stations," Chen said quietly. "All ships. And someone get me a channel to the Spartan on the surface." "Captain," Celeste said. "There's something else." "Tell me." "The grim concentrations on the surface," the AI said. "Every tracking point simultaneously." She paused. "They've stopped moving." Chen looked at the display, at the contact, at the planet below. "All of them?" she said. "All of them," Celeste confirmed. "Every grim on the planet's surface that I have tracking data for, all stopped. Same moment the contact completed its scan pulse." She paused for the last time, with the weight of an AI delivering information she had not finished processing. "Whatever that is, the grim know it's here, and they are waiting." Outside the viewport, in the dark of an uncharted system that was rapidly becoming a very crowded one, something vast and patient and old beyond any of their reckoning, completed its initial assessment and began moving toward the planet at a speed that suggested it had all the time it needed and had decided to take it anyway.